Fire Emblem Fates permanently split a Nintendo fanbase, literally, and in more ways than having players choose between its three versions, Birthright, Conquest, and Revelation.
Didn't expect that, did you?
Being one of Nintendo's most enduring franchises, nearly as long-running as The Legend of Zelda or Metroid, Fire Emblem 2 has a storied history of experimentation across its many entries. At its core, though, it's always been a tactical RPG series known for its daunting permadeath feature, where your soldiers are individuals that won't come back if they die, making every decision on the battlefield matter, as one wrong move could lead to losing them forever. Fire Emblem developer Intelligent Systems has also increasingly focused on player choice over the years, something they'd toyed with all the way back in the very first Fire Emblem. But this time around, for the 14th entry in the series, they went a bit further than just having the player decide between two different opposing characters. They'd chosen to make the core concept of a whole game entirely based upon player choice. This decision led to Fire Emblem Fates' multiple versions, very much akin to the Pokemon series. But what followed with Fates' reception was a divide between fans and players so great, and backlash so public, that the developers seemed to not have fully anticipated at the time, the ramifications of which we're still experiencing today. Since the release of Awakening, the 13th entry, and first 3DS Fire Emblem game, series veterans began to feel a growing unease in the new direction that Fire Emblem was embarking upon. Awakening was nearly the last entry in a dying series that somehow managed to turn everything around. Among its various experimentations with the series formula was its decision to appeal to a more general audience, with a slight change in tone, more simplified gameplay, a casual mode, more overtly sexualized female characters, and a newfound focus on romance between the player and their soldiers. All of a sudden, their beloved series was getting dumbed down. Fire Emblem was becoming a dating simulator. But for some, it would be their first introduction to the series, and they would go on to love Fire Emblem in their own way, with these newer games as their main points of reference. In disdain, elitists even dubbed those in this camp Fate's Awakening babies. They felt they had no concept of the purity and uncorrupted excellence of the games that came before. The following game, aiming to continue Awakening's success and newly revitalized mainstream interest, took its newfound spirit in stride, doubling down on this new direction in all the right or wrong ways. This, plus the numerous explosive public controversies that would go on to surround it, would permanently split an already splintering fanbase, further embroiling the fledgling community into complicated discussions surrounding fan service, morality, and lesbians, cementing it as the most divisive Fire Emblem of all time. These are the many controversies of Fire Emblem Fates.
We're not bad people, but we did a bad thing.
Chapter 1. Petting.
Whoa!
Perhaps the most infamous controversy of Fire Emblem Fates, the petting scandal. In early 2016, ahead of the game's release outside of Japan, Nintendo confirmed it would be removing a feature from the Japanese version of the game that was known as skinship. In Japan, skinship refers to displays of affection, like hugs, holding hands, or soft caresses of the cheek. In Fates, the player can invite guests to the private quarters area of their castle. This results in a live 2D animated image of them appearing on screen, followed by some spoken dialogue and hearts, which increases support with that character. But in the original Japanese version, the intention was for the player to pet or physically touch these characters in minigame fashion in order to attain this boost. Regardless of character gender, orientation, or age, the player would be petting everyone's faces in between their other castle duties. That's certainly one way to get to know someone. The feature itself wasn't sexually explicit, just a little odd, perhaps, to those from other cultures. And so, concerned about the strange implications of this feature for Western audiences, Nintendo's localizers opted to remove the petting aspect and instead have the player receive the reward boost without having to physically interact with the character at all. This resulted in the rather short and oddly stilted scenes in the final game, where characters appear, utter a line, and then promptly leave the room. In actuality, though, during development, developer Intelligent Systems had originally incorporated full-body petting capabilities, and the stylus cursor the player used for such was originally a hand. After review, Nintendo asked them to tone down these aspects of the feature, so what released in Japan was already a tamer version than what was originally conceived. After looking more closely into some of the dialogue that made it to store shelves in the Japanese original, it's not surprising to me that changes had been requested, because if this is dialogue that actually made it to launch, I can only imagine what could have been there before. Due to the news of these intended changes spreading, though, many Western players expressed concern and outrage over what they felt was censorship of this feature, as they wanted to experience it as originally intended, despite the cultural differences and potential strangeness. Some questioned if the private quarters location might even end up completely gutted due to the impending alterations. To their dismay, things were indeed changed regardless of their backlash. However, looking back, I do personally think that the localizers handled this matter in the most tasteful way possible, with the area retaining most of its original mechanics, just not the petting minigame part. The silver lining, though, is that they did opt to keep some of the petting gameplay in regards to interacting with your spouse. Once you've married someone from your roster of characters, you can still experience this feature in a few ways, like using your stylus to softly touch their face and wake them up, or blow air at them using the 3DS's microphone. So, if anything, what we ended up getting was a happy medium and not a complete gutting. But I certainly can't deny the mysterious intrigue that now surrounds the feature in the Japanese version. As far as other changes go, the international release also removed the interactable camera feature while using the hot springs. In the Japanese original, the player was able to look around more closely in the room and at the characters present. Having been altered, this, unfortunately, makes it so that a lot of the room environment of the hot springs now goes unseen in our version, and further hollows out its intended purpose. Bathing suit accessories for the hot springs were also removed, making the final accessory tab only feature standard bathing towels, whereas originally there were a variety of bathing suits available for characters to wear. Unlike the petting alterations, both of these changes seem rather excessive to me, considering we're constantly exposed to people wearing bathing suits in media and at places like the beach. But I suppose if you consider the possibilities of applying bathing suits to, and zooming in on, certain questionable characters, like Elise, perhaps that's what led to these removals. I didn't know I was going to do this, I just figured it might be interesting. Chapter 2. 3 versions, 3 stories.
Listen well.
Please note, there will be some slight story spoilers in this section. Much as the Pokemon series has over the years, Fates experimented with multiple versions for the first time in the series, resulting in 3 separate routes: Birthright, Conquest, and the digital-only Revelation. Upon buying a physical copy of either Birthright or Conquest in stores for $40, the player could then purchase the additional 2 other routes for a discounted $20 each. This resulted in players needing to spend $80 to get the entire picture of the overall story and game experience. The $80 price tag also did not include any further downloadable content, which was, of course, also available at additional costs. Many fans were not happy about this particular scheme, which added insult to injury as each individual game felt incomplete without the additional context gained by its other pieces. Certain story aspects were left unexplained in one route and could only be answered by purchasing and playing another. For example, Nor's conquest of Hoshidan territory isn't at all explained when the player sides with Nor in the Conquest version of the game, where you'd think it would be a central focus. Instead, it's explained in the Birthright route that the reason for its invasion is out of a desperate campaign to acquire more resources and feed its starving populace. Even worse is that the story of Fates overall wasn't very well received, creating even less perceived value to this $80 behemoth outside of its gameplay, the quality of which also varied with each route. Whereas the story was ripe to focus on interesting quandaries and moral dilemmas, especially as Corrin would betray one set of siblings for another right at the start, it opted to, instead, cheaply focus on forced contrivances, wacky plot twists, and nonsensical decision-making made by the characters. Also, unlike Awakening's Robin, Fates' protagonist Corrin often left the player feeling out of sync, disagreeing with the character that they were supposed to be experiencing this world through. The conquest route, in particular, is perhaps the biggest offender here, where Corrin, intending to change the conflict-hungry Nor from within and find a way to achieve peace while fighting with the bad guys, is impotently forced into obeying their obviously evil father and doing his bidding. This results in ridiculous plot developments where the writers create any silly excuse possible to allow good guy Corrin to tiptoe around their father's gruesome demands while still somehow satisfying them. Birthright treats the war like a family road trip, which sees the siblings strangely splitting up with no explanation, with some going missing, completely failing to give arcs to or develop most of them, leaving its overall plot feeling aimless. Corrin seems to have even less of a familial connection to the siblings that are supposed to be their blood-related ones, but actually aren't in a strange twist that I'll get to later. And characters like Hinoka are barely present in their own storyline, where random NPC characters like Zola end up getting more of the spotlight instead. Revelation didn't fare much better either, unsatisfactorily revealing that the illusory purple assailants plaguing the player and the other paths had actually been behind all of the story's major events the entire time, thus leading to the other two routes feeling even more pointless and forced. I think the best way to illustrate the general apathy toward Fates' storylines is to highlight the game's trailer, opening, and animated cutscenes, which did such a good job of giving weight to the plot and creating a serious degree of intrigue with the characters and story that, unfortunately, the actual silly plot and slapstick twists could never truly live up to, resulting in a strange disconnect between the perception of this world and the actual in-game reality of it. Shin Kibayashi, a manga story writer, was brought in to create the story treatment for Fates' Three Paths, following feedback from fans that Awakening's story was rather lackluster and predictable. Intelligent Systems wanted to fix this problem with Fates, but instead, they unfortunately ended up perpetuating it. Kibayashi went above and beyond in his duties, writing an excessive 500-page treatment covering just the Hoshiden characters and story, way more than Intelligent Systems had expected, as they had merely requested of him 10 pages for each of the paths. After somewhat accidentally reaching 500 pages the first time around, he doubted he'd be able to provide the same amount for the other two, but eventually, he did. He later stated that his final contribution could have been made into 2 books, and totaled over 1,500 pages. However, despite his extreme dedication and the wealth of material he provided, his contribution was merely intended as a draft, and when it came to implementing his work, it was, of course, severely cut down and altered by other team members, resulting in what we see in the final game. The staff credits list Nami Kimuro as the writer in charge of the main scenario for the Birthright and Conquest paths, and we later learned that Senran Kagura writer Yukinori Kitajima worked on the Revelation storyline, as well as there being several other staff members who contributed to the game's scenario writing. Perhaps this was a case of too many cooks in the kitchen, and that would certainly explain the extreme differences in characterization across the story paths, as well as the uneven tone and tropey contrivances that the plot relies on. We also know that a lot was changed throughout the development process, like characters having their entire personalities altered from what was originally intended, with Camilla and Sakura mentioned specifically in interviews. There were also entirely new characters added and cut from the story, with the character Hinoka, for example, being an inclusion that was not a part of the original story draft. In retrospect, this explains her distinct lack of presence in the game, even though she is supposed to be a royal sibling. It's honestly disappointing that we may never know where Kibayashi's original treatment took the story, but at the very least, it's easy to see why the final result was messy, poorly received, and contributed to the overall heated controversy and malaise surrounding the game. There was also considerable controversy surrounding the special edition version of Fates. Fire Emblem has featured many special editions of its releases over the years, typically featuring extra goodies like art books, music CDs, steelbooks, pins, and so on. But the Fire Emblem Fates special edition brought something else to the table. It featured a game cartridge with all 3 versions of the game natively on the cartridge, as well as 9 save files instead of the standard 3. This meant that you wouldn't have to pay for or download the other versions into your 3DS's memory. This created an inherently superior version of the game cartridge and way to own Fates, taking up less internal 3DS memory and having plenty of slots for playthroughs across the 3 routes of the game. But like many of Nintendo's limited edition releases, there was a potentially artificial scarcity to these special editions. During its initial announcement, pre-orders online through sites like Best Buy and game stores like GameStop sold out quickly, leaving many unable to secure their copy. Scalpers took full advantage of these pre-orders, snatching up as many copies as possible and relisted them for hundreds of dollars overpriced on sites like eBay. I remember this tumultuous period as I personally spent countless hours across many lunch breaks at work, calling around to every GameStop in my state to see if they somehow, miraculously, had any extra copies that hadn't been picked up, but to no avail. No one had it, though most were aware of the situation and how sought after these copies were, but there was nothing that they could do. Eventually, I succumbed to buying it from a scalper for $100 more than its original $80 price tag. Shameful, I know. However, much later, a GameStop employee that I'd spoken to did eventually call me back, letting me know that they did end up with an extra that hadn't been picked up. She actually remembered me a month after I called, which was incredible. So I raced to the store and picked it up, later giving this copy to a close friend who had really wanted one. I'll never forget that, and I was incredibly grateful for such an effort, even though I'd already bit the bullet elsewhere. I don't think that employee still works for GameStop today, but still, wherever you are, thank you so much to Laura from the Meriden Mall GameStop store. It was an amazing act of kindness and an exceptional way to treat a customer. Chapter 3. Incest.
Goodness gracious!
You're so cool and powerful and epic and sexy and hot, and please just kiss me. I really want a kiss from you. Please, big brother, please. In Fire Emblem Fates, across the 3 games, the player is able to marry anyone that they want to from their main roster of characters, outside of amiibo characters, recruitable bosses, and bond units. This includes characters from their non-blood-related Nori and step-siblings that they grew up with, as well as their supposedly blood-related Hoshiden siblings, who they were separated from during childhood. As you can probably tell, this creates a rather inappropriate dynamic where the game seems to promote incest, another potential powder keg of controversy. While there are many characters you can marry that don't fall into either of these 2 questionable categories, Flora fans rejoice, many of the characters central to the story and who take up the most screen time, and thus player investment, will. As societally embarrassing as it may be to end up marrying someone you're not related to, but that you grew up with as a sibling, unless of course you fancy visiting the homepages of many adult content websites, no. I think it's clear that the supposedly blood-related Hoshidans take the cake here for the most unhinged inclusion. Without a drip of hesitation, the game allows you to marry them, which by definition would be incest. However, to curb the resulting issues that such an inclusion would create, the game then bends over backwards to comply with the player's wishes, and rather ham-fistedly injects reasoning for why this choice would actually be okay. You see, when marrying a Hoshiden sibling, the character will have received a letter from Mikoto, their mother figure, telling them that she foresaw the future and that they would end up with Korin, so she wrote them the letter to confirm that Korin was her only biological child, hand-waving the incest concerns and thus granting them her blessing to be together. This, of course, results in the very odd revelation that the Hoshiden siblings and Korin aren't actually blood-related, in what seems like the ultimate butt pull for a version of the game where these characters' story relevance was that they were actually your real siblings. Even worse is that older sibling Ryoma apparently knew about this all along, but never mentioned it to the player. Maybe he was still quite upset about you trying to marry Sakura and acting passive-aggressively. Azura is a bit of a weird one too, since she and Korin are technically first cousins. Korin's biological parents are Mikoto and Anankos, whereas Azura's mother is Arate and her father is unknown, perhaps some king of Vala. Mikoto and Arate are sisters, thus making Korin and Azura cousins, creating another slightly awkward scenario, this time even with Korin's actual bloodline.
We're a real family now. And I love my family more than anything.
Chapter 4. Children.
Evil be gone!
A fairly popular mechanic first introduced in the 4th entry, Genealogy of the Holy War, child units were once again featured in Fates after their triumphant return and resulting popularity in its predecessor, Fire Emblem Awakening. However, this time around, their implementation and inclusion in the story in general left players scratching their heads. In Fates, as soon as 2 characters achieve an S-rank support level and get married, they immediately bear a child, as one would, I guess, resulting in that child's recruitment mission being available to the player. I know people like to joke about child soldiers in Fire Emblem games, but this one took it as far as it's ever gone. Upon beating the chapter, this mysteriously aged young soldier would then join your ranks like any other. This is explained in-game by the child being raised in the Deep Realms, a nebulous area outside of the typical game world where time flows at a faster rate, resulting in your newly wedded couple being introduced to their now supposedly teenager-aged offspring. This takes place after just a handful of off-screen visits by the parents. So not only does the child go from birth to young adult in an instant, it also further implies a degree of neglect from the parent characters, having only visited their child occasionally behind the scenes. While no official ages were given to the cast of Fire Emblem Fates, which I'm sure was on purpose, there is certainly a visual variety to the ages of its characters. This leaves some looking rather inappropriately young to be married off and start birthing children. Many have often pointed out the character Elise's questionable age in particular, finding localized dialogue attempting to explain that she is indeed of age rather humorous, as it doesn't seem to fit with the rest of her characterization at all. Nintendo's Treehouse Localization division was clearly concerned about the player's ability to marry Elise, and thus wanted to ensure that while she looks and acts like a child, she is, quote-unquote, technically an adult. The character Nyx is another example of this. Nyx was once an evil adult sorcerer, but due to a curse, is now trapped in the body of a young girl. Technically of age, but physically very questionable. She is now also a young girl that is one of the few potential female mothers of the child units, thus requiring the player to pair her up if they hope to get all of them. The children characters can also achieve S-rank supports with each other and with Corrin, though thankfully these were handled mostly with a degree of care, since the idea of these younger characters vowing to marry in much the same way as their adult parents did would be quite strange. So, most end without a mention of marriage and simply concern the characters being together. The S-ranks with Corrin, however, are romantic in nature and do result in marriage, thus also leading to some rather unfortunate scenarios where Corrin can marry the newborn, yet time-altered teenage offspring of their friends and allies. It's cute. But one child character in particular provided the community with even more unexpected controversy. Chapter 5. Soleil's Gay Conversion.
Oh, my goodness.
Back before the days of worldwide releases, Fire Emblem Fates launched in Japan in late June 2015, and wouldn't make it to the West until February of the following year. This left eager fans outside of Japan 8 whole months to speculate and salivate over every piece of information that they could get their hands on. Following the Japanese launch, fans feverishly translated and shared many different aspects of the game, like support conversations, with the rest of the eager Western audience, in order to provide them with further insights before it reached their store shelves. After coming across this information in early 2016, a Twitter user by the name of Ashley made a tweet that was intended to be sarcastic about a particular support conversation they'd read involving the character Soleil. In it, they joked about Fates' apparent lack of progressivism, stating that there was actually a cure the lesbian scene in the game. Online discourse, being what it is, lacking any nuance and verbal inflection, led to the tweet being shared and retweeted heavily by many fans who probably didn't even realize it wasn't meant to be taken as a serious critique. Because of it blowing up and making its way around the community, though, it wasn't long before it began to be picked up by various news sites, who then proceeded to blast the game for featuring such insensitive and questionable material. This applied considerable pressure to Nintendo to address the situation, going as far as stating to Nintendo World Report, "In the version of the game that ships in the US and Europe, there is no expression which might be considered as gay conversion or drugging that occurs between characters." But what exactly took place in this scene for it to have been so incorrectly interpreted in this manner? Well, in the original version of this conversation, male Corrin attempts to help Soleil overcome her challenges with shyness and fainting when trying to interact with other women that she finds attractive. As part of his solution to help Soleil, Corrin drugs her with a magical concoction that causes her to see women as men and men as women, allowing for her to more easily interact with those she couldn't previously. It's made pretty clear that Corrin's intention isn't to make Soleil straight with this little stunt, but instead to help address her shyness as she views it as a weakness. It's also revealed soon after that this stunt doesn't actually work. Soleil's trouble dealing with cute girls remains. Strangely though, this does unintentionally result in Soleil being attracted to Corrin after seeing him as a girl, and does ultimately lead to a romantic heterosexual coupling between the two, which some felt was slightly odd considering her apparent interest in women. The question of whether or not Soleil is lesbian or bisexual also added fuel to this fire, which contributed to many incendiary fan discussions and debates. But if one were to take the behind-the-scenes mechanics of the game into account, she has no same-sex pairings, which might, to some, indicate that she is in fact not a lesbian, and might only truly be romantically interested in men. Perhaps she's just a little bit flirty with women as well, in a less serious fashion. This left fans feeling iffy about the situation though, considering her dialogue. But what exactly is Soleil's actual preference? Let's examine things a little closer. Corrin's S support with Soleil doesn't really count, since Corrin gets romantic supports with everyone, at least heterosexual pairings, and thus it's a bit of a ham-fisted way of giving the player whatever they want romantically, even if Soleil wasn't truly intended to be straight at all.
This is kind of embarrassing, but stay with me forever, promise?
In the Japanese version of Fates, Soleil exists in a sort of awkward place as a character who definitely appears more interested in women, but who can only develop romantic relationships with male characters. This was likely intended as part of a Japanese trope. However, this was changed in the localized version. In the West, Soleil's supports with the other male offspring are largely platonic, with the relationships typically ending where Soleil and her partner are just really good friends, and any romantic interest on behalf of the partner is swiftly shut down. Again, this could have been done due to the questionable nature surrounding the ages of the child units, but her supports with Forest, however, are the exception. In these, Soleil wants to be more than friends, and Forest reminds her that he is not a girl. Forest is a very effeminate male character, meaning that it's likely she's more attracted to him because of his effeminate features. This approach was arguably a pretty good way for the localizers to have handled this situation, outside of completely altering the character's implementation and actually allowing her to have romantic connections with female characters like Corrin or Rajat. In order to have done that, the localizers would have had to have invented these brand new interactions, which would have been a change outside of the typical scope that we've come to expect in the localization process. However, Soleil's male supports ending platonically can certainly be interpreted that she is, in fact, lesbian and not really bisexual, whereas during her recruitment chapter, Laszlo directly implies that she's bisexual, stating, "She's got good taste, in women as well as men. Got a problem with that?" It's worth noting that Fire Emblem Fates is actually the first Nintendo game to allow same-sex marriage ever. So while there might be some complaints and critiques about the implementation or lack of options thereof in this endeavor, it did still break new ground in its own way. Looking back on the situation, the initial outrage over the support was misplaced and exaggerated, since when examined through a more discerning lens, it was clearly not intended as gay conversion. If anything, the real issue should have been more focused around Corrin's non-consensual drugging of Soleil. But in the version that the West ultimately received, the magical concoction was instead changed into a blindfold, addressing the challenges of this scenario in a really ingenious way. Still though, in 2015, this controversy raged on, with articles continuing to be written about it long after.
I can help.
Chapter 6. Camilla.
Sorry, darling.
Since Fates' introduction to the series, the Norian princess Camilla has been a fan-favorite character for numerous very big reasons. But more than ever before, the developers at Intelligent Systems decided to take things further with her cutscenes and characterization. Whereas many Fire Emblem games, especially in the modern era, feature appealing, well-endowed female characters, Camilla has the distinct honor of appearing front and center in some of the most sexualized cutscenes the series has ever seen. In what was a series first, this character's Chapter 13 reintroduction in the Birthright route features her entering the screen as the camera pans around her hindquarters, her bikini area, then a rather gratuitous pass of her breasts, and ends with her playfully pouting and approaching with a hug. Sprinkle in some dialogue about Corrin missing their big sister, and you've got a perfectly blended cocktail of awkwardness, for most people anyway. It's as if the game is screaming as loud as it can for the player to look at how hot their big stepsister is. And if they didn't know what all of her assets looked like before, well, they certainly would now. This footage might feel more at home in a not-safe-for-work hentai game than your typical strategy RPG, and once more left many scratching their heads over such an inclusion. Her nonsensical outfit, halfway between a gowned nun and a Valkyrie in armored lingerie, seemingly crafted solely for this purpose. Even more bizarrely, another cutscene from later on in the game features the protagonist Corrin accidentally running into and bouncing off of Camilla's breasts. All this, mind you, for a character that is in essence your stepsister. While there is no blood relation between Corrin and their Norian siblings like Camilla, they have grown up experiencing Camilla playing the doting older sister role, which certainly raises eyebrows as to her hypersexualized focus throughout the story. It's really a miracle that technology in the world of Fates hadn't caught up to the modern day, lest we'd have ended up with a cutscene of her stuck in a washing machine.
Oh, goodness. I'm glad you stopped by.
Though Camilla's appearance and personality are indeed rather exaggerated, she and the other Norian siblings, save for Xander, are actually a product of King Garen's philandering with his concubines. Before the events of Fates, a conflict took place known as the Concubine Wars, a power struggle where Garen's many lovers attempted to vie for power by taking the late Queen Ekaterina's place by his side. If we take that into account when considering Camilla's personality, it's possible that she was intended to be more deeply affected than Leo and Elise by these events. Perhaps her mother used her own sexuality and Camilla, as her daughter with Garen, as tools to achieve her aims, and may have even passed away during such events due to her distinct absence and lack of mention in the story. Trauma from such events could explain why Camilla often confuses love and violence, and could perhaps lend to her slightly twisted view of motherly love. But for some, that might just still be a backdated excuse for the developer's decision to pander. Despite the rather overt framing of her character and its negative reception, Camilla has remained a fan favorite in the years since. But it is unfortunate that she was given so much extra attention in this way, as she probably would have been even better received had they focused a little less on making her a tool for gratuitous fan service. Intelligent Systems seem to have learned their lessons from Camilla, though, as future entries have severely toned down this extreme level of attention with the well-endowed waifu characters. Chapter 7. Rush Development.
Facts again?
As a project featuring 3 separate storylines, and Fates being the first time Intelligent Systems attempted such a grand feat, it's no surprise that there were obvious shortcomings and blemishes on the final product. In addition to this, it's believed that the game may have been rushed in order to be released in time for Fire Emblem's 25th anniversary in 2015. Though this is mostly speculation, as we'll never know the full story of development. However, there are many signs and leftovers in the game's code that point to this being the case. Many features intended to be included were ultimately cut from the game, alongside numerous skills and items that go unused, various character changes, story rewrites as previously mentioned, and careless mistakes like several weapons with incorrect models in the final release. The lack of availability, yet retained forgeability of a few of the game's rarer weapons may have also indicated that at some point, developers wanted to create a constantly rotating marketplace for the shops in My Castle, where these items would have been more easily accessible. Characters like Nickel and Candice were likely originally designed to be fully playable characters and not just capturable bosses. Their names appear near the start of the character list, alongside other avatar-only supporting characters. They also have critical cut-ins, something that other capturable bosses lack. 6 weapons in the game, specifically the Bamboo Yumi, Caltrop, Harp Yumi, Rinka's Club, Sidelong Yumi, and Robin's Primer, appear with the default bronze or brass weapon models instead of the actually intended models that were fully developed and included in the game's assets. When it comes to the localized version, there's even unused petting dialogue actually recorded by the English voice actors, indicating to some degree that petting might have not been on the chopping block from the very beginning.
Oh, stop! I'm ticklish.
You are a weird one. I don't actually like that.
Hey now. Oh dear.
No way.
I like that. That feels nice. Please don't do that.
You are too weird. That's pretty okay. Stop that.
Yes, that feels good.
The free roaming and dungeon crawling that was featured in Fire Emblem Echoes was also a mechanic conceived and developed for Fire Emblem Fates that ultimately didn't make it. When asked about features developers wanted to add to Echoes that weren't in Fates, Intelligent Systems' Kuzakihara stated, "For one, adding dungeons and allowing the character to roam around freely. In Fates, you can move around my castle and see it over your shoulder view. But the truth is, by then we had already developed a fully functioning roaming function. However, it was not up to the standards we wanted, and so Fates was left with just being able to observe your surroundings rather than move around in it." Bizarrely, unlike other entries, Fates isn't even given a name for its overarching world, simply resulting in the continent being referred to as Hoshido and Nor, a continent named after its two opposing countries. It's a painful example of the missed opportunities that further context and more expansive world building could have provided, and something that Kibayashi may have even already developed in his extensive drafts. Throughout the story of Fates, the player encounters a variety of other locations and tribes, but there is an overall dearth of information and a general lack of context as to their sovereignty in regard to Hoshido and Nor, and so their importance or impact on the overall conflict is left foggy at best. The stark contrast between the Norians' European inspirations and the distinctly Japanese Hoshidans is also not touched upon at all in the game, outside of differentiating the armies and character classes. Some enemies feature prominent historical imagery, like the golems, whose faceplates are based upon the Roman artifact Bocca della Verità, marble manhole covers likely depicting the sea titan god Oceanus. However, there is zero context provided as to the meaning or purpose of their inclusion, outside of them being Roman-inspired like the other European influences present within Nor. Both male and female Kana have critical hit voice clips in the data, which were meant to be specific to each individual route, similar to how Korin's are. Despite this, the clips for both Kanas were never properly implemented. The characters Izana, Scarlet, and Gunter have paired endings with Korin in the Revelation route that also go unused within the final game. The Revelation path, in general, seems to have been the most negatively impacted by rush development. It was pretty harshly panned by players due to its widespread issues regarding unit balance, needlessly tedious map gimmicks, repeated maps and content, and its mostly lackluster attempt at establishing a golden route for the trio of games. Many of its chapters feature characters recruited at bizarrely low levels, causing units to not even be able to deal damage to enemies on higher difficulties. Or they'll even feature unpromoted units later in the game who are recruited alongside promoted units, providing some of the most bizarre game balance in the entirety of the Fire Emblem series. In an attempt to give the player as many characters from the other paths as possible, it also features an extremely bloated roster, whose problems are only made worse by an extreme lack of character interaction within its story. This also goes largely unaddressed by the new support conversations it brought. Instead of providing meaningful moments and interactions between characters from these once disparate enemy nations, it instead opts to showcase conversations about planning surprise parties, in the case of Hinoka and Xander, or sewing lessons with Hinoka and Camilla. Its maps, like chapters 10 and 25, are rather infamous amongst fans as particularly tedious, with the former featuring a snow shoveling mechanic where the player must tunnel through ice from one corner of the map to another, uncovering copious amounts of enemies with droppable items, encouraging the player to uncover every single tile on the map in order to find them all, and the latter featuring irritating sliding rooms that move during each enemy phase. Many maps and initial story beats in Revelation are also bizarrely similar to Birthright, almost as if it forgets it's supposed to be the combined story path, and it overall ends up feeling like a transparent attempt on the part of the developers to have everyone become allies as quickly as possible with little regard to logic. Even more oddly, Revelation doesn't even finally give the player the full story behind things either, still requiring them to purchase further DLC maps in order to find out more about the game's overarching villain. In this case, those being the Hidden Truths and perhaps Heirs of Fate maps. Chapter 8. Localization.
Prepare to be judged!
Sprinkled throughout all the other sections were examples of localization changes. But when the game finally launched for us in 2016, there was even further controversy about the quality of the localization and heavy discussion surrounding the changes that had been made. The reality is that Treehouse, Nintendo's in-house product development division assigned to localize Fates, had already localized many previous entries in the Fire Emblem series, those being Blazing Blade, The Sacred Stones, Path of Radiance, and Radiant Dawn. Treehouse had done so largely without any complaint. This team was not new to this kind of work, even though this time around they were quick to draw ire as many fans demonized the group. Much of the online sentiment was that the localization was filled with errors, inserted unfitting jokes into the dialogue, and cut out interesting information about the lore and characters, so much so that some fans instead opted to spend their time chipping away at fan translations. And while the discourse grew toxic and things became over-exaggerated, they weren't completely wrong. Treehouse had indeed made some head-scratching alterations and inclusions. One of the classic examples of these changes was the removal of actual support conversation dialogue from Saizo and Baruka's C support in favor of a joke support where neither one actually speaks to each other. This was done as a point of comedy, playing off their roles as assassins with stoic, silent-type personalities. While somewhat humorous, some fans were upset to lose the actual conversation that took place in the Japanese version. Another example of Treehouse going too far is the portrayal of the character Izana from the land of Izumo and his introduction. In the Japanese original version, his eccentricities are stylized via extended words and intonation, but when it came to localizing him, instead they opted to add extra fluff dialogue in its place. It's a bit goofy and not super offensive, but these conversations are occurring after a significant story event where Norians invaded the country in order to head to the Hoshidan border. In the Japanese original, this situation is explained, but in the localized version, when asked about his capture and the battle that took place, this actual plot context is sadly lost in favor of making rhymes about how Izumo is all about love, peace, and chicken grease. Moments like these are sprinkled throughout the game and help to further muddle an already questionable script. The Hoshidan and Norian Festival of Bonds DLC were also never localized, which would have included a ton of conversations and CGs for the first-gen characters. Special items like the Heroes brand and Exalts brand were also subsequently limited to one each per playthrough, where they were intended to be more available. The character of Effie is also often highlighted as having been significantly changed in the localization as well, with fans citing that she's much more of a tomboy meathead or jock in our version of the game. But upon closer inspection, I think a lot of this concern has been overblown too. Effie retains her signature traits like her protectiveness of Elise, her love of training and eating lots of food, and she's not particularly more delicate in the actual Japanese script. It seems the biggest alterations were in her private quarters lines. But while angered fans did have a point, and there had been some rather wacky inclusions and exclusions, the reality was that nothing major had been changed or removed, largely just supports and dialogue chains. So again, it merely built upon all the other controversies and was largely blown out of proportion. Thankfully, the localizations of Fire Emblem games since Fates have been accepted and received much better, and were nowhere near as divisive as this one turned out to be.
Nothing is stronger than my love for you.
Except my biceps.
Final chapter. The Impact.
You've earned some respite.
Regardless of where you stand with your position on Fates, During a more excitable era where things got out of hand, I feel, looking back, that much of its flaws were overstated and overblown, and parts of the fandom are now slowly beginning to look back upon it with a growing sense of fondness for a very incendiary, yet now bygone era. Echoes and rumbles of its inclusions still persist in the modern day, and it's clear to me at least that the developers have since taken very serious care with newer entries to avoid creating controversies anywhere near as numerous and as serious as those surrounding Fates. With 3DS Online now shut down, many of the game's unique features and experiences will now unfortunately be lost to time. If you'd like to watch me play through a run of Fire Emblem Fates where we check out some of these, please take a look at my Fates playlist on the channel. You may have noticed a groovy chiptune remix of Road Taken playing throughout this video. I commissioned it from the very talented Ash Cryas. I think it's the best version anyone's done with the track. If you like it, be sure to check out the full release on their channel. I stream Fire Emblem and other games on Monday and Wednesday nights every week, and I'd love to have you there, so be sure to tune in. I've also got a brand new second channel, Lucky Crit x2, that I'm now using for my YouTube streams, clips, and extras, and you can also watch on Twitch. Until then, I'll see you all next time.